They called her the Silent Curse. For 19 years, Daphne existed as little more than a ghost in the gleaming halls of the Solar Pack, a mute Omega treated worse than livestock by the very wolves who should have been her family. She couldn't speak, couldn't shift, couldn't even whimper when they struck her. The Gilded Court whispered that she was hollow inside, a soulless vessel born broken, a bad omen wrapped in skin. Alpha Caden, her destined mate, looked at her with nothing but disgust, as if her very existence tainted his bloodline. But they didn't know what lived beneath her silence. They didn't know that her muteness wasn't a defect. It was a cage. A seal forged by ancient magic to contain something the world had tried to forget. When Caden drags her before the entire kingdom and condemns her to public execution for a crime she didn't commit, he doesn't just sentence her to death. He shatters the last chain holding back the abyss. And what erupts from her terror isn't some fragile Omega wolf begging for mercy. It's the Dark Wolf. The Shadowborn. The creature from prophecy that was meant to devour the sun itself. The massive stone doors of the Great Hall explode inward like they were made of parchment. Debris rains down on the frozen court as something impossible steps through the dust and shattered light. 8 feet of smoke and void and burning yellow eyes, a beast that shouldn't exist, that can't exist. It stands over Daphne's kneeling form like a living nightmare, and for the first time in their privileged lives, the wolves of the Solar Pack understand what prey feels like. The arrogant alpha who tried to execute her? He's about to learn that rejection has consequences. The high priestess who framed her? She's about to discover that some prophecies can't be buried. And the exiled Lord Draven, the dark warrior in the cape who was supposed to be the monster of this story? He takes one look at the creature of shadow and void, and he kneels. Because Daphne wasn't born weak. She was born as something the light couldn't control. And now that the Dark Wolf is awake, the entire Gilded Court is about to learn the difference between a queen and a slave. The sun's reign is over. The age of shadow has begun. And this time, they'll be the ones begging for mercy. The white silk dress they forced over her head was meant for a bride, but Daphne knew it was really a funeral shroud. Her wrists were bound with blessed rope that burned against her skin, leaving angry red welts that wept clear fluid. The handmaidens who dressed her wouldn't meet her eyes. They never did. To look at the Silent Curse was to invite misfortune, or so the superstition went. She tried to steady her breathing as they braided her hair with silver thread, each tug of the comb sharp enough to make her scalp sting. Through the narrow window of the preparation chamber, she could hear the crowd gathering in the Great Hall. Their excitement buzzed like hornets, hungry for spectacle, for blood, for proof that the light always conquered the dark. The purification ritual cleanses the pack of corruption, High Priestess Elara intoned from the doorway, her voice smooth as poisoned honey. She held a golden chalice filled with blessed water, steam rising from its surface despite the cool morning air. You should be grateful, child. Your death will sanctify us all. Daphne's fingers curled into fists, but no sound escaped her throat. It never did. The silence that lived in her mouth was absolute, a void that swallowed every scream before it could be born. The doors opened, and Alpha Caden strode in like a conquering god. He was beautiful in the way a sword was beautiful, all sharp edges and cold purpose. His platinum hair caught the light streaming through the stained glass windows, making him look every inch the holy warrior he pretended to be. When his ice-blue eyes landed on her, there was nothing in them but contempt. Look at it, he said, circling her like she was carrion. Can't even tremble properly. Can't weep. Can't beg. He grabbed her jaw, forcing her to meet his gaze, his fingers digging into her cheeks hard enough to bruise. This silence isn't human. It's demonic. A mark of possession. He released her with a shove that sent her stumbling into the handmaidens. They scattered like startled birds, leaving her alone in the center of the room. The creature you see before you, Caden announced, his voice carrying the practiced cadence of a sermon, murdered 3 children in their beds. Drained them of blood for some unholy ritual. When we found her, she was covered in their gore, and still, she did not speak. Did not confess. Did not even have the decency to lie. He smiled, and it was the cruelest thing Daphne had ever seen. Demons do not feel remorse. They only wear human skin. Lies. All of it lies. But her tongue was a useless weight in her mouth, and her hands were bound, and no one would believe her even if she could scream the truth. She hadn't killed anyone. She'd found the children already cold, their blood painting the nursery walls, and she tried to help, tried to. "Take her to the hall," Caden commanded. "Let the purification begin." The stone floor was cold enough to leach the warmth from her knees through the thin silk. Daphne knelt in the center of the great hall, and the weight of 1,000 eyes pressed down on her like physical things. The court had gathered in their finest, jeweled collars and embroidered cloaks, silks dyed in shades of gold and amber, the colors of perpetual daylight. They looked like angels. They sounded like demons. "Abomination," someone hissed from the crowd. "Should have drowned her at birth," another voice agreed. "The silent curse finally gets what she deserves." Daphne kept her gaze fixed on the floor, on the ancient runes carved into the stone that supposedly amplified holy magic. Her bound wrists throbbed. Her heart was a war drum in her chest, so loud she was certain everyone could hear it. She wanted to run. She wanted to scream. She wanted to do anything but kneel here like a lamb waiting for slaughter. High Priestess Elara ascended the dais, her ceremonial robes trailing behind her like spilled blood. She carried a scroll sealed with 7 wax symbols, each one representing a sacred law. The crowd fell silent as she broke the seals one by one, the crack of wax echoing through the vaulted ceiling like breaking bones. "By the authority granted to me by the Sun Court and the ancient laws of our kind," Elara began, her voice resonating with practiced authority, "I hereby proclaim the crimes of the accused." She unrolled the parchment with deliberate slowness, savoring each second of Daphne's humiliation. "Daphne of no house, no name, no worth. You stand accused of murder most foul. 3 innocent children, their throats torn, their blood spilled in blasphemous ritual. The evidence is irrefutable. Your silence is confession enough." The words were knives. Each one found a home in Daphne's chest, even though they were lies, all lies. She'd been in the wrong place at the wrong time, covered in blood that wasn't hers, surrounded by death she didn't cause. But who would believe a mute Omega over a high priestess? "The sentence is death by purification," Elara declared. "May the light cleanse your corrupted soul." Alpha Caden stepped forward, and the crowd roared their approval. He changed into ceremonial armor, silver plates that caught the sunlight streaming through the stained glass windows and threw it back in blinding rays. In his hands, he carried Daybreak, the legendary sword of the Solar Pack, its blade forged from blessed steel that was said to burn the wicked. He stopped before her, close enough that she could smell the sandalwood oil he used in his hair, the leather of his boots, the metal tang of the sword. When he spoke, his voice was soft, meant only for her ears. "I loved you once," he whispered, and it sounded almost like the truth. "Before I knew what you really were." Then louder for the court, "Let this traitor's death be a warning to all who harbor darkness in their hearts." He raised Daybreak high. Sunlight ran down its length like liquid gold. The crowd began to chant, a rhythmic prayer in the old tongue, their voices rising and falling like waves. Daphne could feel the magic building in the air, pressing against her skin, searching for the darkness they all claimed lived inside her. Caden's eyes were empty as he looked down at her. "Any last words, demon?" She opened her mouth. Nothing came out. It never did. "I thought not," he said, and began to lower the blade. Something inside Daphne shattered. Not her body. Deeper than that. In the place where her voice should have lived, where her wolf should have slept, something ancient and terrible felt the killing edge descending and screamed in a language that predated sound. The scream was silent, but it carved through dimensions, through the barriers that held back the void, through the seal that had been placed on her soul before she could even remember. The runes beneath her knees began to smoke. The air grew thick and cold. And somewhere far away, or perhaps very, very close, something massive opened its eyes. The first crack appeared in the air itself. Not a sound, but a rupture in reality, a black fissure that split the golden light of the great hall like a wound in the world. The chanting faltered. Someone in the crowd screamed. Caden's sword hung frozen mid-descent, trembling in his grip. His eyes had gone wide, fixed on something behind Daphne, something that shouldn't exist. The blessed steel of Daybreak began to tarnish, black spreading across the blade like rot. Daphne felt it before she saw it. The seal inside her wasn't just cracking. It was exploding, shattering into 1,000 pieces that tore through her mind like shrapnel. Every suppressed scream, every swallowed sob, every moment of rage and terror and helpless fury she'd buried for 19 years came flooding back all at once. The pain was exquisite, unbearable. It felt like being born and dying simultaneously. Her body convulsed, back arching, hands clawing at the stone hard enough to break her nails. Her mouth opened in a soundless shriek, but this time, something answered. Something that had been waiting in the dark places of her soul, patient and hungry and vast beyond comprehension. The temperature plummeted. Frost spread across the floor in spiraling patterns, covering the holy runes in glittering ice. The candles lining the walls guttered and died, their flames snuffed by a wind that came from nowhere and everywhere. Shadows began to move independently of their sources, peeling away from pillars and bodies, gathering in the center of the hall like iron filings drawn to a magnet. They were gathering around Daphne. High Priestess Elara stumbled backward, her face pale as bone. "Impossible," she whispered. "The seal should have held. It was supposed to." The shadows condensed, solidified, rose. It stood 8 feet tall, a creature of smoke and void and burning amber eyes. Its form was lupin but wrong, too large, too fluid, its edges bleeding into darkness like it couldn't quite decide where it ended and reality began. Smoke fur rippled across its massive frame, and when it opened its jaws, the inside was an abyss that promised oblivion. The dark wolf had awakened. And it was furious. The creature moved like liquid shadow, circling Daphne's kneeling form with predatory grace. Every step it took left frost in its wake, ice spreading across the marble in delicate fractals. The court had scattered to the edges of the hall, pressed against the walls in a mass of silk and terror. Some were weeping. Others had collapsed entirely, their minds unable to process what they were witnessing. Caden hadn't moved. He stood frozen, daybreak still raised above his head, but his hands were shaking so violently the sword rattled in his grip. The blessed steel had gone completely black now, corrupted by proximity to the dark wolf's presence. His face had drained of all color, and there was something in his eyes that Daphne had never seen before. Fear. Pure, animal fear. The wolf lowered its massive head until its muzzle was level with Caden's chest. It inhaled deeply, tasting his terror on the air, and when it exhaled, the breath came out as a low growl that vibrated through the floor and made the stained glass windows crack in their frames. Caden stumbled backward, nearly tripping over his own feet, and the legendary sword clattered from his nerveless fingers. "Guards!" he screamed, his voice breaking like a child's. "Kill it! Kill them both!" No one moved. The guards stood paralyzed, their weapons hanging useless at their sides. You couldn't fight a nightmare. You couldn't kill the void made flesh. I said, "Enough." The word cut through the chaos like a blade through silk. It came from the shadows near the shattered doorway, from the darkness that had deepened there while everyone's attention was fixed on the wolf. And then he stepped into the light, and the temperature dropped even further. Lord Draven of the Night Guard was a legend in his own right, though not the kind mothers told their children to inspire hope. He was the cautionary tale, the monster that lurked beyond the borders of civilization, the exile who'd been cast out for crimes so terrible they'd erased them from official record. He wore armor the color of midnight, plates so dark they seemed to absorb light rather than reflect it, and a cape of deep blue that rippled behind him like living water. His face was all sharp angles and cold beauty, pale skin stretched over aristocratic bones, eyes the color of storm clouds shot through with silver. There were scars on his hands, on his throat, marks of violence survived and lessons learned in blood. When he walked, it was with the confidence of someone who had nothing left to fear because he'd already lost everything that mattered. The dark wolf's head snapped toward him, lips peeling back from teeth that shouldn't exist, a snarl building in its chest that sounded like the death of stars. Every instinct screamed that this was the moment violence would erupt, that the two apex predators would clash and tear the hall apart in their fury. Draven knelt. He dropped to one knee in the center of the hall, head bowed, one fist pressed to his heart in a gesture so ancient most had forgotten its meaning. It was the salute given to royalty, to gods, to powers that stood above the mortal coil. "Shadowborn," he said, his voice rough as gravel but carrying a reverence that bordered on worship. I am yours to command. The wolf stopped snarling. Its amber eyes narrowed, studying him with an intelligence that was vast and alien and terrifyingly aware. The smoke of its body rippled, undecided, calculating threat versus submission. Caden found his voice, though it came out strangled. Draven, you traitorous bastard, she's a murderer, She is innocent. Draven didn't raise his voice, but somehow it carried more weight than all of Caden's shouting. And your claim to her is void. You sentenced your fated mate to death, Alpha. By ancient law, that severs the bond. She owes you nothing. I'll see you both executed for this. Draven finally looked up, and his smile was a terrible thing. You're welcome to try. The wolf moved then, but not toward Draven. It returned to Daphne, pressing its massive body against her side, positioning itself between her and every other living thing in the room. Its presence was overwhelming, protective and possessive in equal measure, and when Draven slowly, so slowly, extended his hand toward her, the wolf watched his every movement like a hawk watching a snake. His fingers brushed Daphne's shoulder. The wolf didn't tear him apart. It simply watched, waiting, as Draven helped her to her feet with a gentleness that seemed impossible from a man wrapped in so much darkness. Can you walk? He asked quietly. She nodded. It was all she could manage. Good, he said. Because we need to leave. Now. The obsidian fortress rose from the mountains like a blade thrust into the sky. It was built from black volcanic glass that drank in moonlight and reflected nothing back, a structure that seemed less constructed than summoned from the earth's dark heart. Towers spiraled upward into clouds that never cleared, and the walls were carved with runes that predated written language, symbols that hurt to look at directly. Daphne had lost consciousness during the journey, her body finally giving in to the trauma of the awakening. When she opened her eyes, she was lying on silk sheets the color of midnight in a room lit only by floating orbs of pale blue flame. The dark wolf was gone, retreated back into whatever void it called home, but she could still feel it coiled in her chest like a sleeping serpent. Draven sat in a chair by the window, his armor discarded, wearing only black trousers and a loose shirt that revealed the scars crossing his forearms. He was watching the storm clouds gather over the peaks, but his attention shifted the moment her breathing changed. You're awake, he said, and there was something like relief in his voice. She tried to sit up, and pain lanced through her skull. The memories were fragmented. Caden's sword descending, the seal shattering, the wolf tearing through reality itself. She touched her throat, half expecting to find blood, but there was nothing. She was whole. She was alive. What am I? The thought screamed in her mind, desperate for answers. Draven moved to sit on the edge of the bed, close but not crowding, giving her space to bolt if she needed it. You're not what they told you. You're not defective. You're not cursed. He paused, choosing his words carefully. You're not a wolf shifter at all, Daphne. You're something infinitely rarer. You're an avatar of the night. The words meant nothing to her. She stared at him, lost, and he seemed to understand. Centuries ago, before the solar packs rose to power, before the world forgot what lived in the spaces between stars, there were beings who could walk in both realms, the material and the void. Shadowborn, they were called. They didn't shift into wolves. They were the darkness given form. His eyes held hers, steady and sure. Your silence was never a disability. It was a seal. Someone bound you as an infant, caged your power, tried to make you weak enough to control. Ilara, Daphne thought, and somehow Draven understood. The priestess knows what you are. She's known all along. That's why she wanted you dead before the seal broke naturally. His jaw tightened. She failed. Daphne looked down at her hands, half expecting to see shadows writhing beneath her skin. The wolf, that thing that came through. It wanted to kill everyone. It wanted to tear them apart. It wanted to protect you. Draven's voice was gentle. You've spent 19 years swallowing rage, terror, pain. That much suppressed emotion doesn't just disappear. It becomes something else. Something primal. He reached out slowly, telegraphing the movement, and took her hand in his. His palm was warm, solid, real. The darkness isn't evil, Daphne. It's just power. What matters is what you choose to do with it. She wanted to believe him. God, she wanted to believe that she wasn't the monster Caden had proclaimed her to be. But she'd seen what the wolf could do. She'd felt its hunger. "You're afraid of yourself," Draven said, reading her expression. "Don't be. I've walked in shadow my entire life, and I'm still here. Still human, despite what they say about me." His thumb traced circles on the back of her hand, a gesture so intimate it made her breath catch. "I can teach you control. I can show you how to wield the night without losing yourself to it." "Why?" Her eyes searched his face, looking for deception, for ulterior motive. "Why help me?" Something flickered in his expression. Old pain, carefully buried. "Because I know what it's like to be called a monster by people who've never bothered to understand what you really are." He smiled, and it transformed his face from cold beauty to something achingly human. "And because when that wolf looked at me, it didn't see an enemy. It saw someone who might finally understand." The distance between them felt charged, electric. Daphne's heart was racing for entirely different reasons now. "Rest," Draven said quietly, releasing her hand with obvious reluctance. "Tomorrow, we begin your training. Tonight you're safe." For the first time in 19 years, she believed it. 3 weeks passed in the fortress, 3 weeks of learning to touch shadow without flinching, of discovering that darkness could be gentle when wielded with intention. But the peace couldn't last. It never did. The messenger arrived at dawn, a young night guard scout with terror written across his face. He collapsed at Draven's feet in the war room, gasping for breath, his uniform torn and bloodied from riding through hostile territory. "My lord," he choked out. "The Solar Pack. They're coming. All of them. Caden has rallied the Amber Ridge Wolves, the Crimson Fong, even the Western packs who've stayed neutral for decades. He's calling it a holy war." Draven's expression went cold as winter stone. "How many?" 5,000, maybe more. They're 2 days' march from our borders." The scout's hands shook as he pulled a crumpled parchment from his jacket. "He's claiming the Shadowborn kidnapped you. That you're under demonic thrall. That they're coming to liberate you and cleanse the land of corruption." Daphne felt the blood drain from her face. 5,000. The night guard numbered barely 800, and most of those were scattered across the territories. They couldn't win this. They couldn't even survive it. "He's weaponized your existence," Draven said quietly, reading the proclamation. His jaw worked as he scanned the words. "You're not a person to him anymore. You're a holy cause." The dark wolf stirred in Daphne's chest, restless and angry, but she pushed it down. This was her fault. Every death that would come from this war would be because she'd been too weak to die quietly, too selfish to let Caden's blade fall. If she hadn't awakened, none of this would be happening. She made her decision that night. The fortress was quiet when she slipped from her room, dressed in traveling clothes she'd stolen from the armory, a pack slung over her shoulder filled with enough supplies to get her far away from here. If she left, Caden would have no reason to attack. If she disappeared, maybe he'd call off the crusade. Maybe Draven and his people would survive. She made it as far as the outer courtyard before the wolf rose up inside her like a tidal wave. No. It wasn't a word so much as a feeling, an absolute refusal that locked her muscles mid-step. The shadows around her began to writhe, forming a wall between her and the gate, and when she tried to push through them, they solidified like iron bars. "Stop it," she whispered desperately. "Let me go. I have to." "Stay." The wolf's presence flooded her mind, not violent but immovable, and beneath the command she felt something else. Something that terrified her more than any battle could. It felt like attachment. The wolf had chosen Draven, had claimed him as something worth protecting. And it would not abandon him, even to save its own skin. "You're going to get him killed," Daphne hissed at the darkness. "Don't you understand that?" The shadows rippled, and suddenly they weren't forming a wall anymore. They were forming a mirror, reflecting her own face back at her, tear-streaked and desperate and so afraid of her own power that she'd rather run than fight. The wolf was showing her what it saw. A scared girl. Not a queen. Not an avatar. Just someone who'd spent so long being a victim she'd forgotten how to be anything else. "Going somewhere?" She spun. Draven stood in the archway behind her, still dressed for sleep, his hair loose around his shoulders. He didn't look angry. He looked sad. Disappointed, maybe, in a way that cut deeper than any accusation. "I was trying to save you," she said, and her voice broke on the words. He crossed the courtyard in 3 strides and cupped her face in his hands, forcing her to meet his eyes. "I don't need saving, Daphne. I need you to trust that you're worth fighting for." His thumb brushed away a tear she hadn't realized had fallen. "Caden's army isn't coming because you survived. It's coming because he finally realized what he lost when he tried to kill you. He's terrified of your power, and he should be. People are going to die. People die in every war. That's not your fault." His voice was fierce now, almost angry. "But if you run, if you let fear make you small again, then they win. Caden wins. The priestess wins. Everyone who ever told you that you were worthless, that you were nothing, they all win." He leaned his forehead against hers. "Stay. Fight. Show them what happens when you stop apologizing for taking up space." The wolf purred in her chest, satisfied. And Daphne, who had spent 19 years running from everything, finally stood still. The meditation chamber was deep in the fortress's heart, a circular room carved from raw obsidian where the walls reflected nothing and the silence was so complete it pressed against eardrums like water pressure. Draven had brought her here at dawn, explaining what needed to be done in a voice that carried the weight of terrible necessity. "If you're going to fight beside us, you need to stop fearing the wolf," he'd said. "You need to understand it. Control doesn't come from dominance. It comes from acceptance." Now she sat cross-legged on the cold stone floor, alone, every candle extinguished. Draven waited outside, guarding the door, ready to intervene if things went catastrophically wrong. She could still feel his presence through the walls, a tether to the waking world. She closed her eyes and reached inward. The descent was immediate and disorienting, like falling through layers of her own consciousness. The physical world dissolved, replaced by something older, darker, more fundamental. She stood in a landscape made of memory and shadow, where the sky was an eternal twilight and the ground beneath her feet felt like walking on smoke. The wolf was waiting for her. It sat on a throne of blackened bone and frozen starlight, massive and terrible and utterly still. Its amber eyes tracked her approach with an intelligence that made her skin prickle. Up close, she could see details she'd missed during the chaos of the awakening, the way its fur moved like living darkness, the constellation of scars across its muzzle, the weight of eons in its gaze. "What are you?" Daphne whispered, and her voice echoed in the void. The wolf tilted its head, considering. Then it opened its jaws, and instead of a growl, words poured out in a voice that was hers but deeper, rougher, aged by suffering she tried to forget. "I am what you made me," it said. "I am 19 years of silence. 19 years of swallowed screams. Every time they struck you and you couldn't cry out. Every time they mocked you and you couldn't defend yourself. Every moment of rage and terror and helpless fury you buried so deep you thought it might disappear." The wolf's lips peeled back from its teeth in something that might have been a smile. "It didn't disappear, Daphne. It became me." She took a step back, shaking her head. "No. You're something else. You're the darkness they always said I carried. I'm your darkness." The wolf rose from its throne, and suddenly it was right in front of her, too fast to track, its breath cold against her face. "I'm the part of you that wanted to tear Caden's throat out when he raised that sword. The part that wanted to watch them all burn for what they did to you. The part you've been taught to hate since the moment you were born." "Because that part is monstrous," Daphne said, but her voice wavered. "That part is honest." The wolf circled her now, massive paws silent on the shadow ground. "You were never going to be their perfect victim forever. Something had to break. The seal just made sure that when you finally fought back, you'd have the power to actually win." Daphne's hands clenched into fists. "I don't want to be a monster." "You don't have to be." The wolf stopped in front of her, and for the first time, it lowered its head until they were eye to eye. "But you have to stop pretending the rage isn't justified. You have to stop apologizing for wanting to survive. They tried to kill you, Daphne. They tried to erase you for being inconvenient. And you're allowed to be angry about that. Tears burned in her eyes. If I let the anger in, it'll consume me. I'll become what they always said I was. Or, the wolf said softly, you could accept that anger is just energy. And energy can be directed, controlled, used. It pressed its forehead against hers, and she felt the connection lock into place, no longer two separate beings but aspects of the same whole. I'm not your enemy. I never was. I'm the part of you that refuses to die quietly. The truth of it crashed over her like a wave. All this time, she'd been fighting herself, trying to cage the wolf the same way the seal had caged her power. She'd internalized their narrative, that darkness was evil, that anger was wrong, that silence was safer than speaking. But silence had nearly gotten her killed. She reached up and wrapped her arms around the wolf's neck, pressing her face into shadow fur that felt like cool silk and infinite depth. I'm sorry, she whispered. I'm sorry I tried to make you small. I'm sorry I was ashamed of you. The wolf rumbled, a sound like distant thunder. Then stop being ashamed. Accept what you are. All of it. Daphne breathed in deep and let the rage come. Every moment of pain, every humiliation, every time she'd bitten her tongue until it bled. She felt it flood through her, hot and righteous and hers. And instead of drowning in it, she stood tall. The army arrived at sunset, 5,000 strong, their banners blazing with golden suns embroidered on white silk. They looked like angels descending from heaven, righteous and beautiful and absolutely certain of their divine purpose. The night guard stood on the fortress walls, outnumbered 6-1, weapons drawn and faces grim. They knew how this would end. They'd made their peace with it. Caden rode at the front on a white stallion, his armor polished to mirror brightness, daybreak restored and gleaming at his hip. High Priestess Elara rode beside him, her hands already glowing with gathered light magic, the power of the sun channeled through flesh and bone. Behind them, 36 battle mages raised their staffs in unison. Surrender the demon. Caden's voice boomed across the valley, magically amplified. Surrender Daphne of no name, and we will spare the rest of you. Continue to harbor this abomination, and you will burn with her. Draven stood at the battlements, his hand resting on his sword hilt. His voice carried back, quiet but somehow cutting through the distance. She is under my protection. If you want her, you'll have to go through all of us. So be it. Elara's hands shot forward, and pure sunlight erupted from her palms in a beam that turned night into day. The other mages followed, and suddenly the world was on fire. The light magic struck the fortress walls and the night guard soldiers screamed, their skin blistering, their eyes burning. Light magic didn't just illuminate. It purified, it cleansed, and to those who walked in shadow, it was liquid agony. The walls began to crack. The night guard returned fire with arrows and spells of their own, but their magic was defensive, protective. They weren't built for this kind of war. Another wave of solar magic hit, and part of the eastern wall collapsed entirely, crushing a dozen soldiers beneath tons of obsidian. Draven was shouting orders, rallying his forces, but Daphne could see the truth in his eyes. They were losing. They were dying. And it was because of her. She stepped onto the battlements, and the wind caught her hair, whipping it around her face. Below, the solar pack prepared another devastating volley. She could see Caden pointing, directing his mages toward the main gate. One more strike like that and the fortress would fall. Daphne, get back. Draven reached for her, but she was already moving. She didn't walk down the stairs. She stepped off the wall and fell 50 feet to the ground below, landing in a crouch as shadows cushioned her impact. The night guard stared. The solar pack froze, their spells half-formed, as she straightened and began walking toward them. She didn't shift. She didn't summon the wolf. She became the shadow. The transformation was nothing like the violent eruption in the Great Hall. This was controlled, deliberate, inevitable. Darkness poured from her skin like ink in water, spreading across the ground in a wave that swallowed light wherever it touched. Her body remained solid but her edges blurred, bleeding into the void, until she stood as something between woman and abyss. Fire! Elara screamed. The solar magic came at her in a wall of burning radiance, enough concentrated light to incinerate anything living. Daphne raised her hand and the shadows rose with her, forming a shield that drank the light like water into sand. The magic struck and simply disappeared. Consumed. Devoured by the hungry dark. She took another step forward. The Solar Pack soldiers backed away, their perfect formation breaking. Again. Caden roared, desperation creeping into his voice. Burn her. Burn her. They fired everything they had. Every mage in the army channeling simultaneously, enough power to level a mountain. The light converged on her in a pillar of pure solar fury that would have reduced a city to ash. Daphne opened her mouth and swallowed it whole. The darkness expanded, rushing forward to meet the light, and where they collided, the light lost. She pulled the magic into herself, into the void that the wolf represented, and she felt no pain. Only satisfaction. The rage she'd accepted, the anger she'd reclaimed, it fed on their holy fire and grew stronger. The spell collapsed. The battlefield went dark. And in that darkness, Daphne's eyes burned amber. My turn, she whispered, and the shadows came alive. The darkness swept across the battlefield like a living tsunami, not destroying but claiming. It wrapped around soldiers' ankles, climbed their legs, pressed against their chests until they dropped their weapons and fell to their knees, overwhelmed by the weight of something vast and terrible and utterly beyond their comprehension. This wasn't the wild, chaotic violence of the awakening. This was precision. Control. Power wielded with surgical intent. Daphne walked through the carnage untouched, shadows parting before her like courtiers making way for royalty. The Solar Pack army that had seemed so mighty minutes ago now cowered in the dark, their holy light extinguished, their certainty shattered. They weren't dead, she'd held back from that, but they were broken. Caden stood in the center of it all, his armor tarnished, daybreak clutched in trembling hands. His platinum hair was matted with sweat, his ice-blue eyes wide with something that looked almost like grief. When he looked at Daphne, really looked at her for the first time since the execution, he saw what he'd thrown away. "You were always meant to be mine," he said, his voice cracking. "We were fated. The bond. You severed the bond when you tried to kill me." Daphne's voice was her own but layered with something deeper, the wolf's resonance underneath. "You don't get to claim me now that you've realized I'm not worthless." Draven emerged from the fortress gates, his night guard regrouping behind him. His face was bloodied, his armor cracked, but he was alive, and when his eyes found Daphne standing in the heart of the darkness, something fierce and possessive flashed across his features. Caden saw it. Saw the way Draven looked at her. Saw what he'd lost not just in power but in something far more precious. "No," Caden snarled. "No, you don't get to have her. She's mine." He moved faster than thought, pulling a hidden dagger from his belt and lunging not at Daphne but at Draven, going for the throat, trying to eliminate the rival who'd stolen what he believed he owned. The blade sang through the air, aimed true, and Draven was still too far away to block. Daphne was faster. The shadows lashed out like serpents, catching Caden mid-stride, lifting him off the ground by his throat. He gasped, choking, the dagger clattering from his grip. Daphne walked toward him slowly, deliberately, her hand raised as the darkness tightened its grip. "You tried to murder me for a crime I didn't commit," she said, and each word fell like stones into still water. "You built your righteousness on lies. You called me a demon to hide the monster you really are." "Please," Caden wheezed. "Daphne, please. I could kill you." The shadows constricted, and Caden's face purpled. "The wolf wants me to. It remembers the sword. It remembers the fear." She paused, tilted her head. "But you're not worth becoming what you called me." She reached into him with her power, not into his flesh but into his soul, finding the golden core where his wolf spirit lived. It burned bright and fierce, the source of all his strength, his speed, his claim to supremacy. She wrapped her darkness around it like a fist. And she squeezed. Caden's scream tore through the night as his wolf was ripped away, extinguished, unmade. The golden light died. When the shadows released him, he collapsed to the ground gasping, still breathing, still alive. But merely human. "Live with what you've lost," Daphne said quietly. "Live knowing you did this to yourself." She turned away from him, leaving him broken in the dirt, and walked to where Draven stood waiting. He met her halfway, and when their hands clasped, the darkness and the shadow-touched lord recognized each other as equals. The battlefield had gone silent. Every soldier from both armies watched as Daphne turned to face them, the girl they'd mocked now standing as something far beyond their understanding. Slowly, starting with the night guard and spreading like a wave through even the solar pack, they dropped to their knees. High Priestess Alara was among them, her face white with terror and recognition. She'd known. She'd always known what Daphne would become. Daphne opened her mouth, and for the first time in 19 years of enforced silence, she spoke. Her voice was clear and strong and carried the weight of prophecy fulfilled. The sun has set. The shadows embraced her like a crown, and the Queen of Night claimed her throne. If you enjoyed this story, please subscribe to the channel for more werewolf romance tales, alpha kings, rejected mates, and powerful Omega stories. Hit the notification bell so you never miss an upload. Your support means everything and helps me create more content like this. Thank you for reading, and I'll see you in the next.